Is democracy failing? That is the topic for today's discussion. So, first off, let's have a definition of democracy. And I know that you brought one for us today. Could we hear that?
Absolutely. When we say democracy, we're defining it as a government in which the majority of people exercise sovereignty, either directly through ballot measures or town hall style meetings, or perhaps indirectly through elected representatives. What most people would know this by is ruled by the people.
Right, as simple as that. Rule by the people, and that really is the definition that most people are thinking of when they say democracy. They may not have a really eloquent or in-depth understanding of democracy or the democratic process, but they at least understand that element is supposed to be the rule by the people. In other words, the majority. Okay, so I'm going to start this off with a question, a series of questions regarding contemporary democracy right now in the Western civilization, essentially. And we will transition the conversation about halfway through to discussing democracy itself, the premise of democracy. Is it a legitimate system? Is it illegitimate? Is it a good idea? Is it a bad idea? And we'll talk a little bit about that. But first, I'm going to critique what's going on in our democracy right now. And the question I think that we need to ask is, what is needed for a democratic system to survive and what is needed for it to thrive? Now, I see this as on a continuum. In a healthy democracy is thriving. In other words, people are engaged with the democratic process. It truly is the rule of the people or by the people. Democracies can survive a little bit further down the continuum. They can get by its democratic process and stay democratic, but they're not really functioning optimally. And then on further down the spectrum from that is any system that is not healthy enough in the democratic process to maintain its own democratic process. So in other words, given enough time past this mark, it will eventually descend into other forms of government, most likely tyranny, dictatorship, etc., at least in the modern era. So I've identified three elements I think that are really key for a successful democracy. First, you have to have a large percentage of the voters over the majority, definitely more than the majority, have to be critical and rational thinkers. So by saying critical and rational thinkers, I mean they're people that question. They question everything. They question their leadership. They question the political system. They question the media. They question their education. They are critically thinking, analyzing the world around them, and are coming up with rationally, reason-based decisions and opinions that are informed by knowledge based on those critiques. So they're also going to be trying to find solutions to problems in their lives. And they're going to be looking for truth and consistency. Now, this is very, very important, really, to any successful political system, I believe. But in a democratic system, if that falls apart, there are some pretty serious implications because, of course, that means that people who are non-critical thinkers, namely ignorant, are going to be leading the society. The second is bravery. Now, I don't mean this necessarily in the sense that we conventionally think of bravery running into battle or doing something that could potentially get you hurt. That can also be known as stupidity. But bravery is how I would define it as a willingness to do what needs to be done to achieve a goal, especially when it is something that we'll say will not benefit you personally that greatly, but it will benefit. It will lead to what needs to be done. Essentially, making difficult decisions and standing by your actions. So if you don't have that, even if you have people who are critical thinkers, and I would argue that thinking critically and being rational will be correlated with bravery, but not always. But if you have people who are not brave enough to enact and work towards the goals that they've come up with, then you really can't enact any positive change either, and the democratic process will probably start to fall apart. And third, this is also very important. If we have the critical thinkers and we have the people that are willing to step up and do what really needs to be done in society, in spite of peer pressure, popular approval, etc., We need a method of expanding these ideals, not just horizontally to other groups within society, but also to the next generation. So I know that there could be possible other factors we could factor in here to this equation, but I think that those are three that we could start off with. So I have a couple of questions I'd like to ask you as the guest to give me your opinion of just analyzing quickly our own society along these criteria. So critical and rational thinking. Do we see a lot of that in the media?
Well, I think most people who are engaged in the political process, whether actively or passively, would argue certainly, and I am one of them that would argue no, that is not the case.
Okay, I would agree with you there. So we're not going to see a lot of critical thinking in the media, at least from my opinion, from my perspective. Even the good media sources, the educational media sources in the past 10 years have gone so downhill that I really struggle to find any mainstream media source, not just television, but other sources as well, that actually foster critical and rational thinking. What about government proclamations and announcements made by politicians? What do you think about how far critical thinking goes in that avenue?
I mean, politics is so calculated and so focus group oriented that there is no critical thinking involved. It is just words that appeal to a target audience, such as throwing the popular term throwing red meat to the particular interest group, or it is just a very vague and general way to appeal to the most people, and like I said, the most vague way. It's like a fishing vessel. They'll drag their net as wide as they can, and then they'll mostly get a lot of crap at the bottom of the ocean, and they will get some good stuff mixed in there once in a blue moon.
So sounds like that's kind of the antithesis of critical thinking, just really vague generalities and platitudes, etc. And just for the viewers slash listeners, this is not rehearsed. We're talking. This conversation is on the fly. I just have a few notes here, so this is in no way rehearsed. I'm actually getting these answers as we go along. So we're going to go with no for the critical thinking on the government and politics. What about peers? I know this is going to be very situationally dependent, but what do you think about critical thinking as just kind of in the atmosphere of peers, of people and the people that they know?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. It is dependent on the individual. However, I think we can see that many individuals in society do not practice it, and I think we can see by their actions that their in-group preferences are to seek out other people who are not engaged themselves, thereby challenging positions that they feel like they comfortably hold. So I would say no.
So confirmation bias, essentially, in that
That's
regard.
right.
Okay, so situationally dependent. I would argue that the vast majority of people, generally speaking, in the everyday society, are definitely not critical and rational thinkers. My estimate is I would say about 90% are not critical and rational thinkers. I try to expand that knowledge to people as much as I possibly can, but our society seems to have fostered an aversion to rational thinking in this era, which is most disconcerting. But I'll say situationally dependent. Were you going to say something?
Yeah, just real quick, I want to add that this is what is called rational ignorance, and it's basically individuals making a sort of economic calculation, in a sense, that it is in their best interest to remain ignorant regarding in this, we can talk about this a little later when we talk about democracy as a system, but it is often in people's best interest to remain ignorant of what is going on for various factors. So.
I take that point, and I would actually argue I have a lot of experience with this argument, and I would argue it goes along with the kind of ignorance is bliss. In the common speech, everyday language with the average person, they may come to the conclusion that, hey, I don't want to know about some of these things. It's going to make my life miserable. But I would argue, as a rationalist and somebody who is very, very concerned with critical thinking, that actually there is kind of a curve that you as you crest the top, as you go over the top of the curve and you come down, you start to realize that ignorance is bliss to a point. It benefits to a point, and once you get over that point, you start to realize that knowledge and reason actually greatly improve your quality of life and your understanding. But it's so hard to get people over that level, I feel. Okay. Education system. Do you think there's a lot of critical thinking or rational thought in the education system?
Define education system.
So we'll classify, we'll split it apart. So the public education system, the government schools, and then we'll say the college system. We can deal with them separately.
The government school system, absolutely not. The government has no incentive to promote rational thinking, and because if it does, it would weaken its own power. It's a self-defeating purpose. As far as universities, I would also argue no, although there are exceptions. There are individual universities that are exceptions. There are departments in universities that are exceptions. But as a general rule, that is not the case.
Okay, and I would agree with you with that as well. And that rule I would hold with the general population. I would also apply that to academia, and not just introduction level academia all the way up the ivory tower. I would say about 90% non-critical thinkers, and it's very sad, but it is a reality that I have experienced. Okay, what about family? This is going to be like peers again, very situationally dependent, I think. But let's just focus a little bit on the general mainstream society parental model. Is there a lot of critical thinking or rational thinking being bestowed?
I would argue absolutely not, and perhaps this is a topic for another day, but the first and foremost indication that there is a lack of rationality is that over 90% of parents in the United States still hit their children as a means of discipline on a regular basis. And I think most people can agree that violence or aggression is the antithesis of rationality and reason.
Okay, I would tend to agree with you on that as well. So, where is critical thinking endorsed in society?
That's a good question. You may find it in certain aspects of the internet, the alternate media, and maybe certain private schools, but that's even going by the wayside due to private schools' dependence on federal or state subsidies to their schools. So it's pretty difficult to find. I mean, you can search on the internet, and that's really about it.
Yeah, and that's what I would really take this very short digression to emphasize to anybody who cares to listen. That critical thinking is something that you have to foster within yourself, and you really have to care about it. You have to care about reason. You have to care about improving yourself, your surroundings, your loved ones, and you have to make it a part of your daily rituals and routines by reading high-quality literature, by studying philosophy, by studying politics, society. It's not something that just happens. It has to be fostered. And one of the things I think it's a great disservice to the future and to our society, how it's actually intelligence and reason have actually come to the point where they're berated. I mean, I think of the movie Idiocracy, and where if you act intelligent, if you are intelligent and you display that intelligence around certain people, they will be offended by it, and that I think is very very sad and very dangerous. So going down this list, well, let's do this two more times really quickly. Going down the things that we just mentioned, the media, government, peers, education, family, do we see, would you argue that any of those sources endorse bravery as I've defined it, essentially working towards to meeting your goals in spite of the resistance of those who are opposing you? Do we see much of that in any of those avenues?
Generally speaking, no. Although I would argue that the family unit would be the only one that I could make a case for that we would see that.
Okay, I would generally agree with you, but I'd actually put a caveat on that and say that I think that bravery is actually endorsed by a lot of media, a lot of peers, some in the education system, and some in the government as well, but only when that bravery is attached with certain political ideologies. It's never as just this is a way that you should live your life.
I can go with that.
Okay, and finally, the passing down of these values and these kinds of so the idea of passing down good traits to the future generation and expanding the traits of the democratic process to truly have informed voters. Do we see that being done anywhere?
I would go back to and reference my previous answer and say if we would see that, it would be in the family unit.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely. So I'm just wanting to give a kind of I wanted to touch base with you and see your opinion on these topics, and I would give probably the critical thinking score for our society somewhere between a 20 or a 30%. The bravery score with the stipulation of certain political ideologies. Without that, just endorsing true bravery, I would say probably about 10 to 20%. And the passing down of the values of a democratic system, maybe 30 to 40 at most. That's just very arbitrary, right off, not giving it much thought. But I wanted to talk about setting the stage for this next section, the serious problems that I think that our democratic process faces before we get into the actual theory of democracy itself. Ignorance. So the truly ignorant don't have any awareness that they're ignorant. That's very, very problematic because they don't even know that they need to improve. Oftentimes people who are very intelligent lament their ignorance of things because they understand that they're ignorant of certain topics or they don't have certain knowledge and they wish that they could fill that gap. While the people at the bottom of the intelligence ladder are willfully and happily ignorant because they actually think that they're more intelligent than they are. There's actually, what is that, the Dunning-Kruger effect, I think plays in with that.
Yes.
So that's a major problem. Ignorance, no critical and rational thinking.
Yeah.
We have what turns to in a democracy. This is what I'm really getting at, bringing this back to democracy. If you don't have critical thinkers, if you don't have rational thinkers, we turn into mob rule, where the people, whoever is screaming the loudest and whoever has the largest number of people coming to the polls just pushes everyone else around, and it has no bearing whatsoever on what the best choice is. It just is simply pushing weight around to serve some usually very insignificant kind of social goal, something that's really not that important. So another thing we see, I think it exhibits this kind of mob rule, is how we've gone away from the understanding of how the republic works in the United States. People in the United States seem to increasingly elect presidents as temporary dictators. We allow the expansion of the executive branch because people don't really understand the other branches of government, and they just think that the president is kind of this person who does everything for them. And it's amazing, you can see this play out when people, they expect their entire lives to change dramatically and fundamentally as soon as the president is elected, because this person is now control of everything, which is obviously going to break down the system of the republic and the checks and balances that were put there to begin with.
Right. It's sort of like how you see that among historians and the population, the presidents that have done the most sort of executive rule by fiat are generally ranked the best presidents. Whereas the presidents, like, in my opinion, the best president we've ever had, John Tyler, is the president that basically ceded that he has very little power and did little in office.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And this is where I'd like to put in another just point that I'd like to make. I believe that roughly 95% of human problems are totally preventable. And this is why it's so important for me to, why I started this channel and why I have these discussions, is to talk about things using reason. I believe that using reason, using critical thinking, fostering strong character can eliminate easily 95% of the problems that we face in society. And so it's very important to remember that we do have control of these issues. When you see these problems that come out in society, people kind of think, oh, it's beyond, how did this ever happen? It's beyond our control. No, you're just ignorant of how it began. You don't understand how it began. You maybe don't have the knowledge. You need to expand your knowledge, expand your mind, understand what the root of this problem is. And once you understand that, you can actually eliminate it. And that's why I advocate for this. So another issue I think that we face today is that people, especially since the 1960s, but it seems to be getting worse, at least among certain populations, is that people are spoiled. I mean, really spoiled. Some people I've come into contact with, not just in acquaintances, but also people that I know in my personal life, people who refuse to work because it would be easier for them to collect a check from the government. People who refuse to work because that's not the job that they want. It's okay to just not do anything because I want to have a better job, so I won't work at all. Never-ending excuse making. Never-ending excuse making is always something else or somebody else. And of course, screaming, give me what I want now and give it to me for free. These are all major problems in a democratic system. Because democracy, like any system, if it's going to work, and when I'm saying democracy, I mean it loosely, a democratic republic, any kind of a democratic system, requires people to work diligently, try to make their lives better, try to make their societies better. If you turn into a system under which people are just trying to grab as much as they can from the system, I think that right there in itself is the fundamental breakdown of a democratic process, because democracy is about working together as a society, is it not?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, you're actually referencing something that is just my problem with democracy in general, is the basically the incentive for government officials to loot the system, loot society, loot the system through various means. And I agree with what you're saying.
Right, yeah, absolutely. The pillaging of the voting class, essentially. We'll get to that in just a couple minutes. So another thing that I think we're seeing more and more today in democracy, not just in the United States, across Western civilization, is anger as a means of resolving conflict. And this is a major, major warning sign. All the things that I have talked about now, those are the early stages. We started to see these, the things that I mentioned earlier started to really come into place decades ago. And now we're seeing long implications, or what happens long term, the implications of some of these changes in our society. And I think that we're really starting to gear up in this regard, as far as people are angry. And I'm not talking about rational anger. You're upset because something has been, there's some wrong that's been done against you, and or somebody, you've made a great argument and somebody's not going to address it. I'm talking about irrational anger. the kind of people who essentially are saying, even though they're not saying this openly, they are screaming it non-verbally, and they're screaming it through their other words. You are wrong, therefore you should go away. And go away has a lot of implications. It starts with the kind of dismissal that somebody will give a rational argument in everyday conversation. I have plenty of experience with this. And again, we're talking about rational arguments, so this is not just somebody's having a disagreement, a domestic disagreement, or they're having an argument with their friend about which movie to see. We're talking about rational arguments being made and the dismissal of those arguments.
Right. It's almost like you're describing a state of rage where anger oftentimes can be used as a force of good. It can be used as a force of rationality. When one enters a state of rage is when they become irrational. And it's almost like a lot of people, invoke this rage when they hear an opinion that sets off some kind of emotional trigger, and they feel personally attacked, and like they're in danger. They're physically in danger by hearing a differing opinion.
Well, because their egos are under threat. They've been raised with very, very poor self-concept, and everything that they hear that is a disagreement to them, they have no ability to reason against it and put a reasoned argument against it. So in a very fundamental psychological sense, it is an attack against them because they're so immature in their thinking that it's actually fracturing their worldview.
Well, that's right, and there's no sense of curiosity in this state of rage that I think we're describing, and that comes from childhood, where children are in a household or a state of existence where curiosity is not fostered, and when they hear an opinion that either they've never heard of or they don't agree with, rather than try to understand that point of view, it doesn't mean agree with it, but rather than try to understand it, they have this severe emotional reaction to it.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that something you said, from my perspective, I'd clarify from my own perspective. I don't think that it's not that there's necessarily rational anger, but there is anger which is rational. So if that makes any sense, it's not like, if you're angry about something and it is rational to be angry about that, then that anger is justified. Let me put it that way. While if you're angry about something and you have no rational justification for it, that is not rational. That is just belligerence. And these people who don't have the ability to think or the willingness to think rationally about these issues, they just have the anger. And then that gets paired with what? If we're not pairing it with reason, we pair it with something else. Usually propaganda served by the served in a cold dish by the media, and then we foster that, and it turns into that rage that you're talking about. So the rage, it starts off with the dismissals, and I found that people who think this way tend to have two initial kind of dismissal reactions. Either it is the anger, and we're going to avoid the argument, avoid talking about it, avoid thinking about it by anger, and the second is just disappear. They just disappear from conversation. They change the subject if it's in person or if it's on social media. They just disappear from the dialogue. And I've even prompted people several times to come back gently, prompted them to come back to conversation, and they refuse. Because I think that some of them on some very low level understand that they've been bested, but they don't want to consciously recognize that. So that's the first stage, is that dismissal. The second stage of the go away kind of mentality, you are wrong, therefore you should go away. And when I say wrong, of course, it's in quotations because there's no rational justification for the position, usually, is, well, in the social media landscape, I'm going to block you. And we see how this is used as this kind of tool of confirmation bias, and again, this in-group preferencing to not expose oneself to alternative viewpoints. And I think that's very disconcerting, because now we're reaching the stage in society where it's okay to riot and assault people that are, in quotations, wrong. We are about one short step away from those rioters turning into murderers. And I don't think it's much of a leap to go that extra step. If you add some more propaganda, some more chaos, some more anger to the mix, all you need to do is look back to the Cultural Revolution in Red China and find out just what those kinds of people will do when they are given the endorsement of the government.
Well, that's right, and actually, you see that in quite a quite many places across the globe, especially places that do not have democratic systems. So, Latin America, for instance, South America, Central America, Africa, in Egypt or Venezuela, or these countries that do not have a democratic history. They protest, they rage, in a sense that they want democracy. Um, they hold these democratic ideals, or what they feel are democratic ideals, and at the same time, they're not practicing democratic ideals because they often go out and murder their opposition.
Yeah, absolutely. And the disconcerting thing is this is something that we don't generally see in Western society, but now we are starting to. We're seeing it in Greece, we're seeing it in France, we're seeing it in the United States, and a lot of other countries. And that should be very alarming. What's even further alarming from that is that oftentimes it seems that the city police that are involved in these riots do nothing about it. So they seem to be complicit in this kind of cue to violence. And then we have, of course, the media who douses the flames in gasoline. For instance, what's going on with the various Trump rallies, where it's essentially you don't have to make an argument against Trump. You don't have to come up with a rational argument to explain why he's wrong. You just call anybody who even steps foot inside the arena Nazis, fascists, phobics, haters, evil, right-wing extremists, etc., etc., etc. And these people, you dump this ignorance propaganda on these crowds, and they just run with it. They march right in line to cause all this havoc, and they feel completely justified in doing so. That's what's really troubling. These aren't people that you can reason with. They're not people that you can say, hey, you shouldn't be doing this. Don't you see why? Because there's no reasoning. The reasoning is not there. It's absent. So this is... going back again to democracy, why this matters to democracy is because if you don't have discussion, if you don't have a rational discussion, all democracy turns into is one group beating the crap out of another. And that means, ironically, because it seems that this is a major problem on the left side of the spectrum, of what has been known to be called the regressive left, they're all about the minorities. However, yet they endorse a system which is essentially the beating of the minority group by the ignorant majority. So I think that just again shows the kind of facade on this propaganda machine that endorses this. It's not about democracy at all. It's about power struggles. And the political elites are perfectly happy to allow these rioters to do their dirty work for them. It seems that they purposefully orchestrate these kinds of things to enact social change for them.
Well, that's right. I mean, social change, generally speaking, comes organically through an evolution in society, and when one who is in a position of power does not want that change to come, or does not want that change to come organically, they, in a democracy, will utilize subtle methods like this to, they can wash their hands of it. I mean, the 6 degrees of separation, but they are connected often to these events.
Absolutely, and that's why, again, if you foster critical thinking, if you foster rational analysis, you can see this. You can see the gears turning. It's very obvious, but people are again willfully ignorant. They don't want to see what's going on. Right before we're almost ready to transition to the argument about democracy and is the system itself, but quickly as my kind of final points. I think that the system, again, if you study Red China and the Cultural Revolution, a lot of this makes a lot of sense in the tactics being used. But the masses, I think, are being used as a thug force by political elites. And it seems that they are being used to demand for their own rights to be stripped away, because the masses will be pushed in this direction, take that right away, pushed in that direction, take that right away, whether it's the Second Amendment, the First Amendment. There are so many, in the United States at least, so many of the amendments in the Bill of Rights have been just stomped all over, and a lot of it has been done through the will of the voters because they don't understand their rights. And it seems that they're being tricked into giving more and more and more power to the state, to the government, while giving up more and more of their rights, and only really they're being focused to focus in on rights or privileges that really aren't even that significant in the big scheme of things. And I think this will go on, or it could potentially go on. I mean, there's many options in the future here as far as politics, but this could potentially go on if it were done according to the playbook that the state would like to, or the political elites would like to use. It'll go on to the point where the mob has sufficiently stripped away as many rights as possible, and then finally the state will infringe upon some of the rights of the mob. And the mob will say, well, don't take those away from us, and the state will have so much power at that point that there'll be absolutely nothing that can be done about it. And again, the mob rule, I think that is a good segue for talking what we're going to get to, the meat of the philosophy and the discussion behind the democratic process. We can start that now. Mob rule. So how do we avoid the mob rule of democracy, or should we not even bother? Is the system itself broken?
I would argue the latter. I mean, it's as Winston Churchill once said, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. Well, the fact is he was half right. It is the worst. It is the worst form of government. It's a failed experiment. It's the antithesis of liberty and freedom for the individual. This form of government empowers the elites at the expense of the average individual by encouraging government officials to loot and plunder the taxpayer as much as he or she can during their short tenure in office. This action occurs through various means, including lobbying or campaign donations or just growing bureaucracies of people who are not elected, who have no accountability to the voters. And these bureaucracies simply benefit the officials and their friends. Democracy is a way for people to reward their friends and punish their enemies. And I mean, I maintain that no system of government ought to exist, but if we must exist within a sort of a statist society, then we need to choose the least bad system, and I would argue that it is not democracy.
Okay, that's great, because I'm going to ask you now, of course, what is a better system if it's not democracy? But first, I want to clarify, when you're talking about democracy, are you talking about democracy in the ancient Greek sense of the word, or are you talking about the republic in which we were supposed to be, or we were modeled after in the United States at least, and which now seems to be falling apart?
Well, I think it could fall under both. I mean, rule by the people, by the collective.
Okay, so I just wanted to make sure that definition was still good for what we're about to talk about. So you're talking about essentially, the rule by the people style government.
Yes, the rule by the people, the majority rules, whether there are protections in a constitution or in a document that are supposed to protect the minority. Anything that empowers the collective majority to rule over all is often a force for bad, for evil.
Okay, so then what would you suggest is the alternative? A lot of people are thinking right now, when you say that, they're going to, okay, well, what are the alternatives? We have monarchy, right? So you have a tyrant that rules over you. Dictatorship, which is the unelected monarch, or it could be elected. I mean, but it's a monarch essentially with more power usually, and it's not necessarily hereditary. You have totalitarian regimes that consider themselves democratic, but they're of course not, like the Soviet Union, Red China. I mean, even modern China isn't very democratic. We have tribal systems. We have dynasties. So what is the alternative that we could say that's actually would be better for the average person than the democratic rule?
I maintain that the ultimate goal of an efficient and just society is a society in which the freedom of the individual is maintained. And I argue that no system of government can truly afford that to a society. However, within the paradigm of statism, which we currently live under, I would absolutely maintain that, for instance, a monarchy would be better. A system where one or maybe a small family of sovereigns rule over a geographical area. So, I mean, a state or a government is simply a monopoly of force in any geographical area, and I maintain that an individual or a small group of individuals who maintain supreme power will, and power, lifelong power, will do a better job at maintaining an efficient and just society than temporary rulers or representatives or public servants.
So you're making the argument because they don't have to face elections that a lifelong ruler would be better suited for this.
I'm looking at it from the standpoint of ownership. And when you have democracy, nobody truly owns the government. Nobody, the public lands, nobody really owns them. It's the mysterious collective that owns them. However, oftentimes those at the top are the only ones that benefit from that. But it's only temporary. As I said earlier, that these people are in for a short amount of time. They loot and plunder while they're in office, and they leave their successors to deal with the mess. Where a monarch, let's just for the sake of argument say a king, in a sense of some European style, king that we saw at one time in England or France. Because they and they alone own, quote unquote, their territory, their region, their state, that they have more of an incentive to take care of their people, their subjects, than somebody who is only there for a short amount of time. It's like comparing ownership of a car versus renting a car. Nobody rents a car and worries about the oil change. Nobody does that. Nobody cares about spilling coffee on the seat because it's not theirs. It's somebody else's problem. Whereas if they own the car, it's not always the case that they take care of it, but they have more of an incentive to take care of something that they own, that they can, sell or trade or pass along to their heirs than somebody who is only in for a short duration of time.
So it's the legacy. That's what you're talking about. It's a hereditary rule. There's an incentive to pass down the legacy of the empire or the kingdom, to pass it down to your descendants, and therefore you're going to try to expand it, take care of it, maintain it better than somebody who is just in office for a few terms and is fleecing the system to get what they can out of it.
That's right, and often you have proponents of small government or what have you in the United States who argue that there should be term limits and there shouldn't be career politicians, and that often sounds good. But the last thing we want to do is encourage somebody to be in there for a short amount of time as some kind of duty as their servant. Now, I would argue that having a senator or a representative in office for life is not the answer, because we still have that style of government of democracy. And so what I'm talking about is not lifelong representatives or senators or presidents within the framework of a democracy, but I'm talking about lifetime ownership in a completely different style of government.
Okay. I'm reminded of the Frank Herbert's Dune a little bit, the neo-feudal system of the future. Um, so, what would somebody say, or what would you say to somebody who would suggest that there may be a problem with this in the form of dynasties like we see in North Korea with Kim Jong Un now, the dictator? Obviously, he's a third generation dictator. He has more power than a monarch, arguably, and he is definitely not operating the country that would be even. I mean, I think you could make an argument between South and North Korea. There's no doubt that South Korea and the South Korean people are doing exponentially better than North Korea. So, in those kinds of situations, is there any kind of a check that could be put on that? Or is that just something you'd say, well, every now and then you just get bad apples?
Yeah, absolutely. You have any style of government is going to have these cases of sort of a system gone bad, and this North Korea is no different. But one could easily, in a sense of democracy, could point to, the Nazi Party in Germany. Was it 1933? They were put into power by a democratic system. You
Well, that's
know,
a valid counterpoint. That certainly is. We have had quite a few horrible leaders put into place through democratic processes.
well, absolutely, and I mean, we don't even have to go that far back. Go back to 2011 in Egypt, when you had a call for democracy, and democratic elections were held, and the most extremist party was put into place. Morsi was the president's name. He was a total, uh, just an extremist in every way. He murdered people. Anybody that he disagreed with, despite he talked a good game about respecting the rights of Christians in the region, but he was a total Islamist in a sense of just this extremist dictator, and he ended up being deposed in a coup d'etat, and now Egypt's doing better than they were under a democratically elected president. So, you have, and people can point to, well, Europe is doing pretty well in a democratic system,
I would
the
argue
United
that's not the
States.
case.
I would as well, but you have this correlation between the more democratic principles a society enacts, the worse off the society is. So, look at in the United States, you have the progressive era, is as it was called in the early 20th century. The 17th Amendment was the direct election of senators. So rather than have governors of the various states uh, appointed or appoint senators, you have direct election, to give more power to the people. But ever since the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century, you have this call for increasing democratic principles in the country, but the prosperity of the people, the individual freedoms of people, it's a total correlation between the rise of democratic principles and the decrease of the economic wealth and freedoms of individuals.
Well, I don't know what you mean. Senators always act in the best interest of their constituents. That's a well-known fact.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, think about it like this. Since we're on the United States, I mean, a representative democracy where, you vote for somebody to do your bidding. Well, if you feel like, if your opinion, if we're voting for the same people, and your opinion is the complete opposite of mine, then how can one person equally represent us? I mean, if I hire a lawyer to do my bidding and that lawyer does not do my bidding, I will just hire a new lawyer. But the problem is if the senator does not do my bidding, well, he or she may do the bidding of the majority of everybody else. Thus, you have competing interests. So at least in a system of monarchy, the monarch is going to do what he or she feels is the best, and regardless of what you think. So uh, I I go back to that argument that it's just a better form of government.
Well, there's at least a bit of transparency there. You know that if you're being ruled over by a king or queen, that you can expect to be ruled over, not expect to be consistently and totally manipulated and lied to for your vote. So
Right, and
there,
it's overt too. There's no hiding. There's no obfuscation of when a king rules by decree, he admits he rules by decree. When the president, when George W. Bush or when Barack Obama rule by decree, they they either admit they don't admit to it, or they try to hide it in the name of democracy, as in, well, I have a mandate from the people to do this. So whether that's true or not, I mean, nobody can really know because there's so many competing interests.
so what went wrong with? We'll stick at the United States. What went wrong in the founding of the republic? Because the founding fathers were very concerned with liberty. They were very concerned with having a free society. They didn't want to have the kind of tyrants that they saw in Europe. They were getting away from that. So, in producing this system, they thought, well, this is much better than monarchy. I mean, if they were a part of this conversation and didn't know a history, they would probably be saying, well, why would anybody want to go back to the monarchy when they could have freedom? So, what went wrong, in your opinion, from fighting against the so-called tyranny of the monarchy and coming to a point where we say, wow, the tyranny of democracy is actually worse, or at least you're making that argument. What went wrong there?
Well, we have to understand that during the colonial period in the United States, prior to the breakaway, you have even though the colonies were ruled by the King of England, there was a foundation of classical liberalism. So, free markets, individual freedom, that was there. You don't read a lot about it in the textbook, and oftentimes, yeah, sure, there wasn't that there. And when the republic was founded, there was more individual freedom. But the problem is the wealth. Wealth in a democracy can never ensure that the government remains small, because the wealth breeds special interest, it breeds lobbyists, it breeds business interests who continuously turn to the government to increase their power, which would have to increase the government's power. So what you had is a sense of classical liberalism, or in today's terms, you might look at it as libertarianism, or you had that in the colonies to some extent. And when that was turned over into a democratic system, there actually was more individual freedom initially, but there's no checks and balances in a democracy that can really stop that from growing. So there's no individual who can the president has no ability to say this cannot happen, because there's the system of checks and balances. So I would say that the colonies were doing fairly decently, and when democracy was implemented, the American people enjoyed a short period of a, I would say, an efficient, an economically wealthy society, and it wasn't shortly thereafter that it started to, I mean, let's be honest, it started to go downhill. I mean, it was almost right away where you had presidents like Washington march the army across Pennsylvania to enforce a whiskey tax, which arguably was an unconstitutional act. You had the John Adams, the second president of the United States, uh, imprisoning journalists for writing negative things about him. I mean, these are all things that can happen under a monarchy, but there's less chances. There's more checks and balances in a monarchy than there is in a democracy.
It's interesting. This brings something that's in the back of my memory. I can't quite put my finger on it, but it was something that I learned in my academic training. I don't remember who it was now, but the idea was that it may have been something by Foucault. Uh, the idea that in a monarchy, the punishment was to essentially set an example, but you didn't have the system of punishing people in mass for petty offenses. It was more like you blasphemed against the church, or you said this thing about the king that is not allowed. We're going to punish you to set an example. But kind of the people are almost like a separate entity from the aristocracy, so you let them do their things as long as they don't get too uppity. I brought that into mind the way you were what you were just talking about. But not to get into a digression. Now, you are an advocate for a stateless society. I am not. Just for transparency, we do disagree on some of those areas there, but I do believe in liberty in many ways. And it sounds like what you're saying here is that there's this kind of when you get a state system going, even if it's democratic, there's this kind of eventual entropy pulling everything towards corruption.
Well, that's right. I mean, I absolutely do advocate a stateless society. However, if if we're going to have a state, a monarchy, and when I say monarchy, I don't necessarily mean I want to go back to King Louis the 14th. I mean there's religious aspects to that. It was just a different culture,
Make for good
but
fashion, though.
yeah, that's very very true. Um, so I'm not necessarily advocating a return to, the European style monarch, but just the idea that yes, I believe in a society with no rulers, but if there is going to be a ruler, so to speak, then it ought to be one that acts as a monarch and I mean, absolutely democracy. I think democracy absolutely breeds more corruption than a monarch. I mean, I guess the question I raise is what system of checks and balances does the United States, which arguably is the best example of democracy ever in human history, I mean, what system is in place in the United States that has a check on corruption? I mean, people can point to the Constitution, but
Well, the
there's
Constitution is practically meaningless at this point. It's been so steamrolled.
well, and that's absolutely true. And as the great 19th century anarchist Lysander Spooner once said, that either the Constitution permitted the anti-liberty agenda that we see going on today in the government, or it failed to protect people against that agenda.
I think
And
that it
either way,
failed.
it's unfit to exist.
Yeah, I think that it failed. I think that it absolutely failed. It was not, and I don't necessarily fault the founding fathers specifically, but I think that um, they just did not. Not to say that a better constitution necessarily wouldn't have failed, but I think that it definitely could have been better to help mitigate some of those problems. But going back to, from my perspective, I'll present you an argument here. A lot of this corruption you're talking about it has to do with payoffs. There's no accountability. We're talking about corporatocracy, corporate influences in the government, lobby groups, et cetera, et cetera. This giant money trail just pouring into Washington. So I have a lot of ideas of my own systems, and I'm not going to get into all that now. But could we not enact perhaps a couple measures to retain a democratic society and mitigate these? For instance, could we not perhaps make a constitution, again, if we were going to make a better constitution, perhaps clearly defining and separating the state and the economy? So there is essentially no payoffs going on between the economy and the government because it would not benefit anybody to do so. There are no regulations that could be made that would benefit any corporation by the government. Therefore, there would be no money trail. And perhaps we could put salary caps on senators and Congress people. We could say, you make $25,000 a year, and that's what you make. There's no incentive to go in for money in that regard. What do you think about those kinds of ideas?
Well, it's certainly interesting as far as the salaries go. I mean, why not? I mean, if being in the government, if being a public official is one's civic duty, is a if you're a public servant, then why do you need paid at all? I mean, if you're just there for a short amount of time, in New Hampshire, the state legislature gets paid $100 every 2 years, and that's all they get. I mean, is sure, New Hampshire is arguably one of the freest states in the country, and maybe there's a correlation there, but no, I mean, I just, it's possible that those checks could work, but I wonder how long they would work for. I mean, the Constitution, which I would argue is, the Constitution, which replaced the Articles of Confederation, which by far was a much superior document. It was replaced in the middle of the night in a coup by bankers and politicians, and the Constitution itself, as bad as that was at the outset, only lasted a short amount of time. So I think these ideas could work, but I wonder how long they would last and what system is in place to ensure that they do. I mean, the problem with democracy is that nobody is in the marketplace. If I vote with my dollar, so to speak, if I buy a product that does not work, I am punished by that by having a bad product. If I buy a good product, I am rewarded by having a good product. In the marketplace, there's a system of reward and punishment when you quote unquote vote with your dollar. But if you vote for a terrible president, let's say you voted, I don't know, for Jimmy Carter, then 4 years later, it's not like your power is and the democracy is reduced because you voted for a terrible president. There's no checks on individual, in a democracy where everybody's a sovereign, there's no check on that individual sovereignty. There's no reward and punishment system. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. I could see a check being put into this, though. We could always say, well, we could make a constitutional amendment that would state that any publicly elected official at any time could be recalled and impeached by the voting populace, not just the government itself. However, you can probably see where that would descend really quickly. You didn't vote for the bill that I wanted, therefore I'm impeaching you. Mob rule. So
that's exactly right.
Right back to the mob rule again. And I'm going to say something controversial right now. I'm not going to go into great detail on it, but I believe that this is why votes, essentially voting rights, should not be in a truly advanced democratic society, should not be a birthright. You should not get to vote just because you were born in the country. There has to be some other qualifier, and I have an elaborate system set up to explain that, but I'm just going to leave that as a teaser. It's not as insidious as it sounds at first. As far as the senators, Congress people getting a certain amount of money. We could even go deeper than that. We could actually give them just a living stipend, have them live in dormitories, and give them robes like in ancient Greece, and that is all they get. So if you see anybody wearing a suit, you have to call them in by the police, and they can get fined because you know they were getting a payoff somewhere.
Well, that's exactly right. But at the same time, right now we see the level of influence that private entities have on elected officials. What if, let's say that they're not making anything, or they're making, my idea, if I'm going to be I don't know, a representative in my area or a senator, then I would take a salary that was equivalent to the median income, for instance, of the place or the region that I would represent. I mean, that's something, but that you never see. But if you're making so little in comparison of what's going on now, then there's even more of an incentive to take a payoff from private entities who want to influence your vote.
Yeah, absolutely. And I am 100% on board with the realization and the reality that the governments of just about the entirety of Western civilization right now are completely infiltrated by money interest. It is so obvious. There's so much propaganda, so much manipulation of the system going on. There's so much ignorance in the voting population about it that you can just see it playing out in regular affairs, especially you look at international affairs and you look at the kinds of trade agreements and immigration agreements and people turning the other way and not turning a blind eye to things, or countries turning a blind eye to things. And there's no way to explain it other than the whole system has become infiltrated and corrupt. So yeah, anything else you'd like to mention about this topic? Because we're going a little bit late this time, but
No, other than just everybody that likes democracy is wrong, and they need to think about it some more and learn to love a king.
well, I think that we should just we should take a cue from our peers in this society and just say, well, if you disagree, if somebody disagrees with you, if they think democracy is a good system, they need to go away.
Off with their heads, you might
Yeah,
say.
well, I certainly am being facetious, obviously, but that seems to be the going trend of how people think. And that's really what is scary about that go away mentality, is that I'm afraid that that's what it might lead to at some point.
Yep, I fear we are already there.
Yeah, they're one step away. Okay, well, thank you for listening. Did this whet your appetite on this topic? I know that we just scratched the surface. So tell us if you like this topic. We will go deeper. This is just an introductory discussion. We will go deeper. Should we talk about the current failures of the democratic system in the West? Should we talk about better systems and problems with democracy? Should we talk about the ignorance of the voting class? Any of these topics, if you want us to go deeper, we can go deeper in a future video. Just leave us a comment in the bottom and we will review that. Thank you so much for listening. And don't forget to vote in November.